For Carol and Reggie Sumner, their new home in Jacksonville was supposed to be a sanctuary, a place to heal, to breathe, to start over after years of pain. But while they were unpacking their lives, 4 teenagers were digging their deaths. Literally digging. Days before the Sumners even went missing, their killers had already chosen the location, bought the tools, and carved out a deep, silent grave waiting in the darkness. They didn't stumble into danger. They were led into it. Led by someone they trusted, someone young, smiling, familiar. What followed wasn't a robbery. It wasn't a home invasion. It was a calculated hunt. And the terror Carol and Reggie faced in their final hours is something no human being should ever have to endure.
In July 2005, the victims, Carol Margaret Sumner and James Reggie Sumner, were both 61 years old. They had lived previously in South Carolina, but in March 2005, they relocated to Jacksonville, Florida. Carol suffered from multiple serious health problems. At the time of her death, court records show she had liver cancer, arthritis, fibromyalgia, diabetes, and hepatitis. She weighed only about 90 pounds, according to autopsy reports. Reggie, likewise, was physically fragile. He required insulin for diabetes, and documents show he used a walker, a cane, even a wheelchair. He also had a recent broken tibia and wore a surgical boot. These conditions made him vulnerable, especially in the eyes of his future killers. Local reporting adds that Reggie worked with CSX Railroad in Jacksonville. There is no solid, verified source in the public court records about him serving in the military. Despite some crime podcast retellings, the court documents do not mention military service. Very little in the trial records describes a dramatic or public love story for the Sumners. They were largely private people. After selling their South Carolina home, they made the intentional choice to downsize and move to Florida for their retirement. Friends described them as generous and caring. Their relocation was not just about geography. For Carol and Reggie, it symbolized a fresh start in their twilight years. Their new home in Jacksonville became more than just a place to live. It was hope, but that hope would end in horror. The Sumners' age and infirmity were not random. At trial, the prosecution argued that these factors made them ideal targets. Tiffany Cole, one of the defendants, knew them from their time in South Carolina before the Sumners moved to Florida. Cole's previous relationship with the couple gave her detailed insight. She knew about their move, their financial situation, and even that they had made $99,000 from selling their South Carolina home. That information would become part of the deadly plan. Tiffany Ann Cole, age at crime, 19. Tiffany Cole was born in 1986 and grew up in South Carolina. By her late teens, she had fallen into a pattern of unstable relationships, financial desperation, and drug-related environments. When she met Alan Wade, her life pivoted sharply. She became involved in his circle, including Michael Jackson and Bruce Nixon, all of them older teens or barely adults, all unsettled and all deeply influenced by each other's behaviors. Cole's connection to the Sumners was purely circumstantial. She had once seen them as kind neighbors. But once she shared information about their savings and frailty with her new group, it became the catalyst for the plot. Alan Lee Wade, agent crime, 18. Alan Wade had a history marked by instability. Raised in a turbulent household and surrounded by peers who normalized illegal activity, Wade gravitated toward quick money schemes and increasingly reckless behavior. By 2005, he was unemployed, faced constant financial pressure, and openly discussed plans to commit robbery. When Tiffany told him about the Sumners, their age, their trust, their bank account, Wade began to view them as an opportunity. According to court testimony, Wade crafted the blueprint of the crime, the surveillance, the home invasion, and what he later described as a no loose ends approach.
Michael James Jackson Jr., age at crime, 23.
Michael Jackson Jr. had the most extensive criminal exposure of the group prior to the Sumners case. He was known to police. He often engaged in drug activity, and he had a reputation for unpredictable, aggressive behavior. Jackson joined the plan for one reason: the promise of fast money. His role quickly became hands-on. He was physically present at every major stage of the offense, from planning to execution. Bruce Nixon, age at crime, 18. Bruce Nixon grew up in a difficult home environment and associated with an older peer group that pulled him into delinquency early. Unlike Wade and Jackson, Nixon had no major violent history before this offense. He later confessed that he was intoxicated at the time of the planning meetings and was pressured to participate. But he also admitted that he knowingly helped dig the grave before the crime, a detail central to the prosecution. Nixon eventually became the state's most important witness. His confession provided the timeline investigators needed to reconstruct the case. This was the reality behind the friendly visits the Sumners believed were harmless. 4 teenagers, each with their own history of instability, desperation, and poor judgment, were quietly forming a plan that would escalate far beyond robbery. The Sumners were unaware that every interaction, every conversation, and every small act of kindness was feeding information into a scheme already in motion. In the weeks before the attack, the relationship between Tiffany Cole and the Sumners looked harmless on the surface. But behind the scenes, a detailed plan was forming, one driven by greed and shaped by misinformation. Tiffany told Alan Wade that the Sumners were wealthy, claiming they had access to large bank accounts and valuable assets. In reality, the couple lived on disability income and modest savings, but the misinformation had already taken root. What began as a robbery plan escalated quickly into something far more organized. According to phone records, witness testimony, and Nixon's statements, the group made multiple trips to the Sumners' home days before the crime. They watched the house, studied the neighborhood, observed when lights were on or off, and noted the couple's movements. During at least one visit, Tiffany went inside under the pretense of a friendly check-in. This allowed the group to confirm their physical condition, their home layout, and whether there was anyone else living with them. The Sumners had no idea they were being evaluated. Statements later provided in court showed that the discussion shifted from robbery to eliminating witnesses. Alan Wade and Michael Jackson reportedly shared the belief that old people could not fight back, and that removing them would prevent identification. This was the turning point, when robbery became a plan for homicide. One of the most disturbing verified details of the case is that the grave was dug before the Sumners were ever taken. On July 8, 2005, Nixon led investigators to a remote wooded area near Charlton County, Georgia. It was here, based on his confession, that he and the others had dug a large pit intended as a burial site. Nixon told detectives that the pit was dug days before the crime. They used shovels purchased specifically for this purpose. The intention from the beginning was to bury the Sumners alive or after killing them. These details were later fully corroborated. In the days leading up to the crime, the group purchased duct tape, plastic sheeting, gloves, shovels, zip ties, flashlights, and other items later recovered by police. Receipts confirmed the timing. They were bought specifically for the abduction. Text messages and witness testimony showed that the group believed they could withdraw thousands, possibly tens of thousands, from the Sumners' accounts. They discussed forcing the couple to reveal their PIN numbers. They assumed the account held far more money than it did. This financial fantasy became the driving force behind the plan. At the day before the crime,
The group gathered in a motel room and finalized the timeline. Tiffany would drive them to the Sumners' home. Wade and Jackson would lead the entry. Nixon would assist. They would abduct the couple, restrain them, and force them to provide banking information. Then transport them to the pre-dug grave in Georgia. According to testimony, Tiffany stayed in the car during the crime but fully participated in planning, transport, and ATM withdrawals afterwards.
With their plan complete, the group waited until nightfall on July 8, 2005. They believed the Sumners were vulnerable, isolated, and unable to defend themselves. They were right. And the crime that unfolded that night, documented in confessions, phone data, and physical evidence, became one of Florida's most disturbing cases involving young offenders. On the night of July 8, 2005, the plan the group had rehearsed in detail moved into action. The sequence of events is reconstructed from multiple sources: Bruce Nixon's confession, phone records, physical evidence, and statements made during trial. Tiffany Cole drove Alan Wade, Michael Jackson Jr., and Bruce Nixon to the Sumners' home in Jacksonville. She stayed in the vehicle while the other three approached the house. According to Nixon's statement, Wade and Jackson entered first. The exact method of entry was confirmed by investigators as forced entry through a back door. Once inside, Wade and Jackson confronted Reggie and Carol. Both victims were immediately overpowered, consistent with their documented physical limitations. Court reports show that both were tied with duct tape. Their hands and feet were restrained. Their mouths were taped. Nixon later confirmed that Carol and Reggie were alive, frightened and asking what was happening. The group demanded the Sumners' ATM PIN numbers. Evidence shows they attempted multiple withdrawals shortly after leaving the home, confirming the timeline. The first successful withdrawal occurred at a nearby ATM shortly after midnight. The footage captured the offenders using the couple's bank card. The Sumners were forced into the trunk of their own vehicle, a 1999 Lincoln Town Car. Duct-taped, restrained, and unable to see, they were transported across state lines from Jacksonville to rural Georgia. This trip took approximately 1 hour based on phone tower pings and Nixon's testimony. The group drove into a remote wooded area in Charlton County, Georgia, the site where they had dug the grave days earlier. Nixon stated that the Sumners were still alive when they arrived. Investigators later confirmed that the depth and size of the grave matched Nixon's description exactly. Nixon testified that the Sumners were removed from the trunk while still bound. They were placed into the grave while begging and asking why this was happening. Court documents show that dirt was shoveled onto them. The offenders confirmed they were alive at the time the burial began. The grave was packed down with shovels and with the weight of one of the perpetrators. These findings were supported by the medical examiner, who concluded that the cause of death was homicide by burial while alive. After burying the Sumners, the group drove to various ATM machines. They used the stolen card to withdraw as much money as they could, typically $500 at a time, the maximum allowed. They rented motel rooms, bought drugs and food, and began spending the stolen funds immediately. But while the group was spending the Sumners' savings, something unexpected happened. Their transactions triggered alerts. Within hours, the investigation began, and detectives quickly uncovered inconsistencies that pointed them in a very specific direction.
The disappearance of Carol and Reggie Sumner was reported on July 10, 2005, 2 days after the murders. The Sumners' daughter, who lived out of state, had been unable to reach them and notified authorities. When police arrived at the Jacksonville home, they noted the back door was unlocked. Dirty dishes remained in the kitchen. Reggie's surgical boot, required for his recent leg injury, was left behind. Personal items, including medications, were missing. Investigators immediately suspected foul play due to the Sumners' frailty and the lack of any natural explanation for their absence. Almost immediately, law enforcement discovered suspicious ATM withdrawals from the Sumners' account. Surveillance footage showed Michael Jackson Jr. and Alan Wade using the Sumners' debit cards. The rental Mazda, driven by Tiffany Cole, was captured in multiple locations near ATM machines. Phone records placed the suspects near the Sumners' home and along the route to Georgia at the time of the crime. These digital and physical evidence immediately connected the 4 offenders to the Sumners' disappearance. By July 14, 2005, law enforcement located Tiffany Cole, Michael Jackson, and Alan Wade at a motel in Charleston, South Carolina. Authorities seized items belonging to the Sumners, including checkbooks, driver's licenses, financial records, and Reggie's coin collection. Bruce Nixon, who had been present but less actively involved, confessed to police and cooperated fully, providing exact details of the grave's location in Charlton County, Georgia. Investigators traveled to the remote wooded area in Georgia described by Nixon. The grave contained both Carol and Reggie Sumner, buried under 2 feet of soil. The medical examiner confirmed both were alive when the burial began, concluding mechanical asphyxiation as the cause of death. These discoveries corroborated the confessions, ATM footage, and phone data, establishing an irrefutable timeline of premeditation and execution. The investigation produced multiple forms of evidence: testimonies from Nixon and other witnesses, surveillance video of ATM withdrawals, physical evidence recovered from suspect possession, phone tower records placing suspects near both the Sumners' home and the burial site, receipts for tools purchased in preparation for the crime. This overwhelming body of evidence led to charges of first-degree murder, kidnapping, and armed robbery for Cole, Wade, and Jackson, with Nixon receiving reduced charges in exchange for cooperation. The meticulous investigation left no question about what had occurred. But for the Sumners family and the Florida justice system, the next step would be the courtroom, where the full horror of the murders would be laid bare. The arrests of Tiffany Cole, Alan Wade, Michael Jackson Jr., and Bruce Nixon set in motion one of Florida's most closely watched homicide trials of the mid-2000s. The case attracted national attention due to the victims' vulnerability and the unusually young age of the perpetrators. Bruce Nixon, the youngest of the group at 18 years old, cooperated with law enforcement immediately after his arrest. He provided investigators with the exact location of the burial site in Georgia. He gave detailed testimony of the planning, abduction, and execution of the murders. In exchange for his cooperation, Nixon pled guilty to second-degree murder and received a lengthy prison sentence rather than the death penalty. Tiffany Cole, Alan Wade, and Michael Jackson Jr. faced charges of 2 counts of first-degree murder, 2 counts of kidnapping, 2 counts of armed robbery. The prosecution presented confessions and detailed testimony from Nixon, ATM and financial evidence showing withdrawals from the Sumners' accounts, phone tower records confirming the suspects' locations, receipts and tools purchased in preparation for the crime. This overwhelming body of evidence led to charges of first-degree murder, kidnapping, and armed robbery for Cole, Wade, and Jackson, with Nixon receiving reduced charges in exchange for cooperation. The active participation of Tiffany Cole driving the vehicle and factoring into the financial evidence led to her conviction as co-defendant in the kidnapping and murders. Tiffany Cole was originally sentenced to death, but later resentenced to a life imprisonment without parole. The initial death sentence reflected the court's acknowledgement of the cold, deliberate planning and execution of the murders. Over the following years, appeals challenged the validity of confessions, the application of the death penalty for young offenders, allegations of procedural errors in trial. However, Florida's Supreme Court repeatedly upheld the convictions, confirming the thoroughness of the investigation, the reliability of witness testimony, and the weight of physical evidence. The murders of Carol and Reggie Sumner remain a sobering reminder of how vulnerability can be exploited, how trust can be manipulated, and how
Premeditated violence can come from within familial circles. For the Sumners family, there was closure in the convictions, but the loss of two lives, so gentle, so trusting, can never be replaced. The case continues to be referenced in Florida as a cautionary example of the intersection of youth, manipulation, and lethal intent.